She showed up on blind date, covered in mud. The millionaire was about to walk away until he saw her eyes. The River Cup Cafe sat quietly beside the Mississippi, tucked off a slow road in Baton Rouge. It was little more than a wooden deck strung with old lights, a handful of chairs, and the steady sound of water nearby. But to Andrew Lowell, it was perfect. Every evening, he came at the same time, to the same table, with a black coffee in hand. After years of skyscrapers and sleepless markets in New York, the quiet of this riverside town felt earned. His former life, a whirlwind of finance, private jets, and polished deals, had collapsed. No scandal, just losses that couldn't be reversed. He'd walked away. Now, he wore flannel instead of Italian suits. Alongside his college roommate Henry, he'd helped build a small chain of riverside cafes, spaces designed not for profit, but peace. And this was supposed to be another quiet evening, until Henry interrupted it. "She'll be here at 5:30, Henry said casually, wiping his hands on an apron behind the counter. Andrew looked up. "Who?" "Someone worth meeting," Henry said, smirking. "I'm not dating. That's why I didn't ask. Just sit. Drink your coffee. Don't run." Andrew stayed. Out of courtesy, maybe curiosity. At exactly 5:30, she arrived. She stepped through the side gate barefoot, hair windblown, golden, falling from a loose ponytail. Her green sundress clung to her calves, streaked with drying mud. One hand held her sandals, the other pushed damp hair from her face. Andrew nearly stood to leave. She looked like she had swum here. What kind of setup was this? Then she looked up, and everything paused. Her hazel eyes locked with his, warm, steady, tired but bright. She smiled, not embarrassed or flustered, just open. "Hi," she said, brushing hair from her cheek. "Sorry for the entrance. I just pulled a kid out of the river. The mud's a bonus." Andrew blinked. She dropped her sandals beside the chair and sat across from him like she belonged there. The air shifted, warm, unscripted. "You pulled a kid out of the river?" he asked. She nodded, wringing her dress with ease. "She slipped off a rock. I was nearby with my dog. It was either jump or watch her float off." Andrew studied her, unsure whether to laugh or call her bluff, but there was no trace of performance. "I guess showing up to a blind date looking like I lost a fight with a mudslide doesn't help first impressions," she said, grinning. He let out a quiet breath. He could have left, could have made a polite excuse, but he stayed. Something about the way she said it, the way she was entirely unbothered by the awkwardness, the mess, the way the last light of sunset lit her hair like wire gold. "I'm Clara," she said, reaching across the table. He took her hand. It was damp, a little rough, honest. "Andrew." And something settled between them, not loud, not forced, just there, quiet, steady. Like the river itself had paused to listen. The River Cup Cafe was quieter now. The soft murmur of river wind curled through the open-air patio, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and something darker, deeper. Mud, maybe. Or memory. Golden light spilled low over the Mississippi, brushing everything in amber. Andrew sat across from her, hands cupped loosely around a mug of black coffee, still trying to make sense of this barefoot stranger with riverbank in her hair. "So," he began, voice low but even, "do you always show up to dates covered in mud, or was I just lucky today?" Clara laughed, a light sound that somehow made the sunset feel brighter. "Only when I save small children from drowning," she said, brushing at a streak on her forearm. "Mud's complimentary." He smiled despite himself. The awkward tension cracked, just a little. "You said you're a teacher?" he asked after a moment. She nodded. "First grade, which means I teach the alphabet, tie shoelaces, settle crayon wars, and occasionally serve as backup mom. Andrew raised a brow. Sounds exhausting. Only on the days that end in ye, she said, sipping her chamomile tea like it was the world's most normal evening. He chuckled. There was a warmth in her tone he hadn't expected. Not just humor, but something else. Like she carried 100 tiny stories in her pockets and didn't mind if you borrowed one for a while. His gaze dropped, almost involuntarily, to her bare feet, still dusted with earth, resting easily on the flagstone floor. Did you really come straight here after pulling a kid out of the river? He asked. Clara tilted her head, half sheepish, half proud. I did consider running home, changing, brushing the mud out of my eyebrows. Then, her voice softened. But then I thought, if someone's waiting for me, maybe they're worth showing up for, even when I'm not perfect. Andrew looked up. The way she said it, light, but not casual, landed somewhere deeper than he meant to let her see. He nodded once, quietly. There was a pause. So, he said, voice low again, this girl you saved, what was she like? Clara's eyes lit up, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Talkative, the kind of talkative that makes you think the world must revolve around her stories. Bright eyes, pink dress, hair in tight little braids. Andrew froze. She called me a river ninja, Clara went on, chuckling. Then asked if I wanted to come to her birthday party next week. Told me there would be balloons and cupcakes and that I could bring my own juice if I didn't like apple. His heartbeat stuttered. Wait, he said, suddenly serious, reaching into his wallet. Was she wearing something like this? He slid a small photo across the table. Clara leaned forward. Her fingers hovered for just a second before she picked it up. Yes, she whispered. That's her. That's the girl. How do you have her photo? Andrew stared at her, stunned. She's my niece, he said. Ellie. She's staying with a family friend while her parents are overseas. I didn't even know she was near the river today. Clara blinked, still holding the photo gently like it might dissolve. I had no idea. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The river kept moving. A duck flapped noisily near the reeds. Clara set the photo down, careful. Andrew watched her hands. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy in a meaningful way, like something had shifted, not just in the conversation, but in the air itself. Clara glanced out at the river. Andrew followed her gaze. Neither of them smiled, but their eyes had changed, warmer, deeper, more open. The first coffee sat forgotten between them, growing cold as the light faded, and just like that, the story stopped being about mud and started being about something else entirely. The moment Clara confirmed the girl in the photo was Ellie, something changed in Andrew's expression. A flicker of realization, followed almost instantly by panic. He stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped sharply against the stone floor. I'm sorry. Just a second, he said, already pulling his phone from his pocket. Clara watched as he turned away, shoulders tense, pacing to the edge of the patio that overlooked the river. He dialed fast. His fingers trembled slightly. Come on, pick up, he muttered. Finally, the voice of his longtime friend, Mark, answered. The man who was watching Ellie for the week while her parents were away. Mark? Where's Ellie? Andrew's voice was tight. Is she okay? There was a pause on the other end. Clara sat frozen, her fingers curling around her tea glass. She's fine, Mark replied calmly. Wet, but totally fine. She fell down by the riverbank this afternoon, gave us a scare, but she was pulled out right away by a woman. Blonde, muddy, like a superhero in yoga pants. Andrew let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. His knees felt weak. Are you sure she's not hurt? She's already eaten 2 granola bars and told the story 6 times, Mark said with a chuckle. Your niece is indestructible. Honestly, she keeps talking about the woman who saved her. I think she's in love. Andrew let out a shaky laugh. relief crashing through him like a wave. He ended the call and returned to the table, sitting back down across from Clara. Slower this time. The sharpness in his eyes had softened into something far more vulnerable. "She's okay," he said, almost to himself. Then he looked up at Clara, meeting her gaze directly. "She's really okay, because of you." Clara gave a small smile, uncertain what to say. She wasn't used to being looked at like that, like she was a lifeline. "Thank you," Andrew said. His voice dropped lower, steadier. "Not just for this date, but for saving her, for saving my heart." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the rawness in his tone. She looked down, letting the silence stretch for a moment, letting it say what neither of them could quite articulate. Not long after, headlights pulled up to the cafe's entrance. A familiar silver SUV came to a stop just beyond the patio. "That's them," Andrew murmured, standing again. The passenger door flew open, and a little girl in a ruffled pink dress jumped down, clutching a well-loved stuffed bear. Her braids bounced as she ran, and the second she saw Andrew, she let out a squeal. "Uncle Drew!" Andrew knelt, arms wide open. Ellie crashed into him, hugging him fiercely. Clara stood slowly, brushing crumbs from her skirt. Then Ellie turned, and her eyes went wide. "You!" she shouted, pointing with utter joy. "You're the river ninja." Clara laughed, crouching to meet her eye level. "I don't know about ninja, but yes, that was me. Are you okay?" Ellie nodded vigorously, then grew serious. "Did you fall too? 'Cause your dress is super muddy." Clara tapped Ellie's nose gently. "It's part of the superhero costume." Ellie giggled. Andrew stood behind her, watching the interaction unfold with a strange fullness in his chest. He had spent years in boardrooms, winning and losing fortunes, and yet he couldn't recall the last time his world had felt this complete. Clara rose to her feet, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Andrew looked at her, unsure of what to say, then simply followed what felt right. "If you're not in a hurry," he said, voice soft. "Would you walk with us for a bit? I think this might be the first date. I don't want to end early." Clara looked down at Ellie, who grinned and slipped her hand into Clara's instinctively. She looked up again, met Andrew's eyes, and nodded once. "I'd like that." The sun dipped lower over the Mississippi, staining the sky with streaks of apricot and rose. Along the winding path by the riverbank, three silhouettes walked slowly, uneven in height, but moving in gentle rhythm. Andrew walked with one hand in his pocket, the other resting protectively on Ellie's shoulder. Clara strolled beside them, barefoot still, her sandals dangling from one hand. The hem of her dress was dry now, but the dried mud clung to it like a quiet badge of honor. No one mentioned it anymore. The wind off the river tousled Clara's golden ponytail, and in the glow of the sunset, it looked almost painted, gold leaf against a watercolor sky. Ellie skipped between them, humming a made-up tune, her stuffed bear tucked beneath one arm. The little girl had no sense of awkward silence or emotional weight. She simply filled the air with chatter like she had known Clara her whole life. "Today at lunch," Ellie announced, "I traded my apples for marshmallows. Mommy says I shouldn't do that, but they were pink." Andrew arched a brow. "Pink marshmallows are hard to resist." Clara grinned. "You're lucky they didn't trade you the green ones. Those are always suspicious." Ellie giggled. Then, quite suddenly, she turned and asked, "Uncle Drew, can Miss Clara be my private teacher forever?" Andrew laughed, a surprised sound that felt new on his own lips. "Well," he said, glancing toward Clara, "what do you think?" Clara bent down slightly to meet Ellie's eyes and whispered, "If I were your private teacher, I'd have to teach you all sorts of wild things like how to fall and get back up again." Ellie tilted her head. "Like superhero training?" Clara nodded solemnly. "Exactly like that." They continued walking until they reached an old wooden bench beneath a willow tree, its long branches swaying like whispers. Clara sat first, brushing off a layer of leaves. Andrew settled on the other side, Ellie plopped herself in between, legs swinging. A leaf drifted down onto Clara's lap. She picked it up, studying its veins, then began folding it carefully. When she was done, she held out a little heart-shaped leaf, creased with care. "Here," she said, handing it to Ellie. "Whoever keeps this leaf safe until the end of our walk gets to make a wish." Ellie's eyes sparkled. "A real wish?" "A real one," Clara confirmed, tapping her nose. The child held the leaf like it was glass. Her small fingers curled protectively around it. As they sat, a woman with a stroller passed by on the path. She slowed for a moment, taking in the three of them. Clara in her muddy dress, Andrew in his rolled sleeves, Ellie glowing between them. She smiled, then murmured, half to herself, "What a sweet little family." Andrew turned his head slightly, startled by the comment. Clara didn't speak, but something in her posture shifted. Andrew looked at her, really looked. The light filtered through the willow branches and danced across her face. She had a small smear of dried mud on her temple, and still, she looked radiant. Not because of perfection, but because of presence. His chest ached, not with sadness, but with something warmer, something unfamiliar, like stepping inside after too long in the cold. He didn't say anything. Neither did she, but their eyes met for a second too long. And that was enough. The sky deepened into a shade of lavender as they made their way back toward the cafe. Ellie walked ahead, but only a few steps, just far enough to let her arms stretch wide, holding a hand in each of hers. Andrew on one side, Clara on the other. Clara looked down at the little hand in hers, then up. Andrew was already watching her. He didn't smile. She didn't either. But in their shared silence, something had shifted. It was not a perfect day. It was a muddy, messy, strangely orchestrated, golden-lit kind of day. And maybe the perfect ones never held anything this real. Since that unexpected walk by the river, something had shifted in Andrew. Clara had become more than the girl who showed up to a blind date covered in mud. She was now part of his afternoons, part of Ellie's laughter, and part of a slow but certain rhythm returning to his life. There were morning coffees, sometimes at the River Cup, sometimes in takeaway cups as they walked Ellie to day camp. There were texts exchanged late at night, silly dog memes, questions about coffee beans, and quiet admissions about books that made them cry. Clara never asked about his past in finance. Andrew never asked why she always hesitated when someone mentioned home. But in that space of unspoken understanding, something tender began to grow, until the past came knocking. It was a Wednesday night. Andrew had agreed to meet an old colleague at a quiet bar on the edge of downtown, someone floating the idea of bringing him back into the investment game through a new wellness-focused fund. He wasn't sold, but curiosity dragged him there. The bar was dim, all leather booths and soft jazz. He was halfway through a glass of bourbon when a familiar voice sliced through the hum. "Well, well, Andrew Lowell, still playing the humble recluse?" He turned. Veronica, his ex-wife, hadn't changed much. Designer heels, perfectly sculpted hair, and a gaze that could slice through tempered glass. She slid into the seat across from him without asking. "Imagine my surprise," she said, pulling out her phone, "when someone sent me this." She turned the screen. A photo taken near the cafe. Andrew, in rolled sleeves, leaning toward Clara, who was laughing, barefoot, hair tied back with a pencil. Ellie stood between them, holding both their hands. Veronica raised a brow. "Tell me, is this your new PR campaign? A single dad rebrand? Or have you actually fallen for a barefoot elementary school teacher?" Andrew didn't answer. He didn't owe her anything, but her words landed like stones in water, rippling through the still pond he'd been carefully tending inside himself. "You always did love a charity case," she added with a smirk. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of New Orleans, Clara stood frozen in a bookstore aisle. "Clara?" She turned. "Evan." He looked almost the same: sharp suit, polished shoes, the same cologne that used to linger on her pillows. Now, a rising star in a major law firm. "I can't believe it's you," he said, stepping closer. "Still in Louisiana?" Clara nodded, unsure how to reply. Evan wasted no time. "I've seen your posts. That little river cafe life, it's sweet. But come on, Clara, you were meant for more." She stiffened. "I mean, you were always brilliant, always soft-hearted, sure, but never small. And now I hear you're seeing someone?" He scoffed. "A guy who used to be rich, lost everything, and brews coffee now? Clara, you deserve someone who can give you more than second chances and sunset dates." His words hit a nerve she didn't want to admit existed. Clara walked out of the bookstore 15 minutes later, heart heavier than when she walked in. That night, there was no text from Andrew. She didn't send one either. In the days that followed, the air between them thinned. Still kind, still warm, but not as easy, not as open. They didn't speak of exes. They didn't talk about ambition or failure. But in the silences, something crept in, quiet fears and whispered doubts. Andrew caught himself second-guessing before texting her. Clara hesitated before laughing too freely. It wasn't distance in miles. It was the kind that builds when you wonder if you're truly seen or just temporarily understood. One evening, they stood together at the back of the cafe, watching Ellie show off a silly dance move with wild abandon. Clara smiled faintly. "She's going to break hearts someday." Andrew nodded but didn't speak. Clara looked up at him, as if waiting. But Andrew only sipped his coffee, eyes unreadable. And that was when Clara knew something from the past had returned. Not a person, not a mistake, but the quiet fear that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't meant to last. Not because they did not care, but because they cared too much and didn't know how to say it. The days that followed moved slowly, like the river after rain. Andrew sat alone one evening in the back office of the River Cup Cafe, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across papers he had not touched. In front of him was a proposal, a seat on the advisory board of a rising venture capital firm based out of Austin. A generous offer, substantial influence, a return to the spotlight. But the note scribbled at the bottom of the final page made his hands still. "We trust you to maintain a polished public profile, especially regarding personal associations. No controversies, no reputational risks." It was not subtle. He reread the words, then stared out the window at the soft ripple of the Mississippi. Somewhere out there, Clara might have been walking home from school or sitting with Ellie, helping her glue paper leaves onto a drawing. He wondered what she would say if she saw that sentence. He wondered if she had already guessed. Across town, Clara stood frozen in the kitchen of her small apartment, holding a letter she had just opened. It bore the seal of a university in Vermont. Accepted. A full-year fellowship in children's graphic storytelling. Everything she had dreamed about in college. A rare opportunity. Tuition covered. Studio space provided. A mentor whose books she had once hidden in the back of her classroom for rainy days. Her fingers trembled. But the deadline for enrollment was 10 days away, and Ellie, sweet, bright Ellie, had just drawn her first ever real comic strip. It was a stick-figure adventure featuring herself, Clara, and a dragon made of books. She had shown it proudly after dinner the night before, saying, "Maybe you and me can make one together?" Clara swallowed hard. How could she vanish just when the little girl had started seeing her as something permanent? That Friday, rain fell steadily, soft and endless, soaking the sidewalks and turning the cafe's stone patio into a mirror of the sky. Clara came anyway. She wore her favorite sweater, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, hair tucked beneath a hood. The world smelled of wet leaves and brewing coffee. But Andrew was not there. Instead, one of the young baristas spotted her at the entrance and approached with a small envelope. "Andrew said if you came, I should give you this." Clara's heart skipped. She took the envelope, hands damp from rain. Inside was a single folded drawing, clearly in Ellie's cheerful handwriting. Crayon colors spilled across the paper. The picture showed Ellie between Clara and Andrew, each of them holding one of her hands. Behind the sketch, in Andrew's handwriting, were just a few lines. If you love someone enough, you do not ask them to choose. You learn to wait until they are ready to reach for you again. Clara read it once, then again. She sat down at the corner table where they had once shared a lavender latte and a chocolate muffin Ellie refused to split. Outside, thunder rumbled gently. People came and went, shaking off umbrellas and raincoats, ordering hot drinks to warm their palms. Clara stayed. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She did not count. At some point, the barista brought her tea, without asking. She nodded a thank you. Voice caught somewhere in her throat. She traced the lines of Ellie's drawing with one finger, her lips pressed tightly together. This was not heartbreak. Not really. It was something softer. The ache of timing, of silence too long between words, of wanting to reach, but not knowing how. Rain tapped gently at the awning, and in that space of unsaid things, Clara waited, not for an answer, but for the courage to choose what would come next. Andrew stood on his porch, morning light stretching over the cypress trees. Fog clung to the river below like breath on glass. His coffee sat untouched, cold in his hand. He had made his decision. The final offer from the venture capital firm remained unread. 6 figures, prestige, a return to the life he once knew. But none of it tempted him, not after these past few weeks, not after Clara. I used to trade everything for recognition, he had told Henry over drinks. Now I know what that cost me. I won't pay it again. Later that morning, Andrew walked to Clara's apartment. The building manager recognized him. She left earlier today, he said. Big suitcase. Told me to give you this. A cream envelope, smudged faintly with charcoal, no name on the front. Andrew opened it by the stairwell, river breeze curling at its corners. Inside, her handwriting. Andrew, I'm not leaving because I'm hurt. I'm leaving because I need to be someone who can stand without being held. I want to know who I am, outside of falling in love. If you're still by the river when the leaves turn, I promise I'll come back, with my first book, and something worth offering. Clara. He exhaled slowly, folded the letter, tucked it into his jacket, and walked away. 3 months passed. Summer gave way to the hush of early fall. The mornings cooled. Leaves turned gold. The river quieted. Andrew found a rhythm. He walked Ellie to and from art camp. They brewed tea in the afternoons. He taught her to steep, not rush. She repeated his advice like scripture, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth. Each evening, he sat by the river with a cup, watching the sky shift colors like water running off a brush. He didn't chase. He didn't forget. On his fridge, Ellie's drawing remained, the 3 of them, hand in hand. Now and then, between spoonfuls of cereal, she'd ask, "You think Miss Clara's drawing her book?" Andrew would smile. "I hope so." Then, one quiet Monday in October, a package arrived at the River Cup Cafe. No return address, just plain brown paper, sealed with wax in the shape of a falling leaf. Inside, a manuscript. The Muddy Dress Girl and the Boy by the River, by Clara B. He sat down on the patio where they first met. His heart beat slowly but loud. The pages smelled like pencil, ink, and late nights. The illustrations were warm, simple, full of feeling. Each scene held pieces of the story they had lived, drawn by someone who had learned to leave and still return. On the last page, a sketch of 3 figures walking toward the riverbank. Beneath it, in Clara's handwriting, "Some journeys begin not when you arrive, but when you decide to come back. Andrew ran his finger over the words. Then he looked toward the willow by the water. And waited. Andrew buttoned the cuffs of his white shirt slowly, smoothing the fabric down before tucking it neatly into his dark slacks. It was the same shirt he had worn the first time he sat at the River Cup Cafe, waiting for a date he had nearly walked out on, until a barefoot woman in a muddy dress smiled at him like the world had never broken her. Ellie skipped beside him as they walked along the familiar river path, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows. She wore her usual pink dress and carried her favorite stuffed rabbit, clutched tightly to her chest. She glanced up at Andrew with wide eyes. Do you think she'll really come back? Andrew didn't answer right away. His throat was tight. Instead, he offered her a soft smile and squeezed her hand gently. Let's just wait and see. They arrived at the cafe, now closed for the evening, its patio chairs stacked, the river breeze rustling through the trees. The willow tree nearby swayed lazily, its branches dancing like ribbons. And then she appeared. Clara stepped out from behind the willow, her golden hair tied back loosely, a soft smile on her lips. She wore a pale blue sundress, and in her hands, she held a small wooden box. Ellie gasped and let go of Andrew's hand, running toward her. Miss Clara. Clara knelt just in time to catch the little girl in her arms, laughing as Ellie wrapped her in a hug. Andrew stood still for a moment, unable to speak. His eyes locked with Clara's as she rose, and for a heartbeat, it was just the two of them. No time, no expectations, only that same quiet recognition that had begun the moment he first saw her eyes. You still have the heart-shaped leaf? He asked softly. Clara smiled. She opened the wooden box. Inside, between two delicate sheets of sketch paper, was the dried, golden brown leaf, carefully pressed, its shape still perfect. And this, she said, reaching in again, is the wish I made. She unfolded a small drawing, 3 figures walking along the riverbank. A man, a woman, and a little girl in a pink dress, all holding hands. Below the illustration, in Clara's neat handwriting, were the words, I wish we don't miss each other. Andrew stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he reached out and gently took her hand. You didn't miss me, he said. You came back. The cafe reopened a week later for a special event. Guests wandered between tables and easels, admiring the soft watercolor illustrations of Clara's debut children's book, The Muddy Dress Girl and the Boy by the River. Kids giggled as they traced the outlines of Clara's playful characters, while parents lingered near the counter where Andrew stood, apron on, pouring coffee with steady hands. Ellie stood in front of the red ribbon, scissors in hand. Clara stood beside her, cheeks flushed with excitement. Ready? Andrew called from behind the counter. Ellie nodded proudly and snipped the ribbon in one clean cut. The small crowd applauded, and Clara turned toward Andrew, her eyes glistening. He lifted a cup toward her in quiet salute. On the brick wall behind the main display, framed in a simple wooden frame, was the first sketch Clara ever drew for the book. A girl with messy hair, a muddy dress, and a radiant smile, standing in the golden wash of sunset. Beneath it, in tiny letters, was the final line of her dedication. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive with promises or perfect timing. It shows up muddy, breathless, and smiling, because someone chose to stay just for the way you looked at them. If this story touched your heart, remember, love doesn't always arrive dressed for the occasion. Sometimes, it shows up barefoot and covered in mud, but it's real, healing, and meant to stay. At Kindness and Love Tales, we bring you stories just like this, simple moments that turn into something extraordinary. If you believe in second chances, quiet miracles, and the kind of love that waits by the riverbank, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your next favorite love story is just one click away.